Good morning and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Since the overthrow of the Assad-led dictatorship and the installation of a transitional government in Damascus, a state of flux has existed in Syria. Many governments in the region and beyond are jostling for influence, each pursuing its own interests. These include Turkey, Russia, Iran and the USA. What do each of these players want, and where are the misalignments in their goals? Well, to explore these complex questions, we're joined by Nathalie Tocci. She's director at the Institute of International Affairs. Nathalie Tocci, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to you. OK, so US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has had a meeting with President Erdogan of Turkey. Let's kick off there. Why Turkey and why now?
Well, Turkey obviously is the big winner from the overthrow of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. It is very clear that Turkey has been, for a while, the main backer of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the main rebel group that led the overthrow of Assad. And essentially, Turkey has been the one actor, far more so than the West and Western countries, that really stuck with the Syrian opposition, even when, in a sense, all seemed lost, right? And through the support of Russia and Iran, Assad had remained in power. So essentially, Turkey has been the main backer of this group. And now that this group is in Damascus, it is the main player that can really influence the way in which the eventual political process in Syria unfolds.
Right. So what's that going to look like? How would Turkey like to see the political process proceed?
Well, I mean, I would say that Turkey has an interest in, firstly, seeing Syria being reconstituted as a united country, because let's not forget that, when Assad was in power, since the civil war in Syria broke out, the government in Damascus didn't actually control the entire country. So I think there's a question that has to do with territorial unity and governance throughout the country. So that's, in a sense, the baseline. And then I do think that Turkey actually would like to see an inclusive Syria. Now, does that necessarily mean that Turkey would like to see a shining liberal democracy in Syria? I mean, yes, but not necessarily. But I think that certainly it does not have an interest in seeing a radical Islamized Syria taking hold. So I would say that all in all, although Turkey's objectives are not necessarily totally convergent with those of European countries or the United States, they are broadly convergent. And given that Turkey is indeed the main player in this game now, it is really in the interests of the United States as well as of the European Union to try and work with Turkey to this effect.
So essentially everyone, including the United States, well, Turkey and the United States, are working towards a stable transition of power in a united Syria. Would you agree, in summary?
Yeah, I do think perhaps as an addition to this, that there is, of course, a point of friction between the United States and Turkey, which really has to do with what happens in the north of Syria and in particular the Kurds. I mean, it is clear that the United States has been the main backer of the Syrian Kurds. And of course, we know that there is an issue there with Turkey that sees basically the Syrian Kurds as being one and the same thing as the PKK in Turkey itself. So there will be a point of friction to resolve there. But all in all, yes, I would say that...
OK, yes, there is now, you say, there is a conflict with regards to the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds did help HTS. They did fight on the HTS side and supported them in gaining power. So do we see a source of friction between HTS and Turkey as well regarding the Kurds?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, I think both HTS and Turkey will have an interest in Syria being a united country. So there'll be a point of convergence there, which really has to do with the degree of autonomy that the Kurds receive, where probably both HTS and Turkey would like to see less autonomy for the Kurds than what they enjoy now. And so the question really is, how that bargain was going to play out.
OK, let's move on now to Russia. Now, clearly, Russia has been a bit distracted on the war by the war in Ukraine, and perhaps hasn't invested sufficient resources to keep Assad in power in Syria. How do you see the relationship between Russia and HTS progressing?
Well, Russia, much like Iran, I think, is going to now scramble to try and reconstitute a relationship with the new powers in Damascus. Now, does this mean that it's going to be able to recover lost political ground? I very much doubt so. I mean, I think that there is an irreversible loss for Russia. Now, this shouldn't lead us, therefore, to conclude that Russia, or Iran for that matter, are going to be completely out. I mean, I think we're going to see a very significantly downgraded role of Russia in the Middle East more broadly and in Syria specifically, but we shouldn't entirely rule out the presence of Russia in the region.
Right, so we're not sure yet, but they may still hang around for a while. What about Iran? Because
they will certainly try. They will certainly try.
All right, OK, well, wait and see. What about Iran? Because clearly Iran was also one of Assad's backers. A bit of egg on their face, no?
Well, more than egg on their face, because whereas I would say that for Russia, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, unlike Ukraine, which is part of an imperial project, in the Middle East for Russia, it's a quote unquote geopolitical game. In the case of Iran, this is what, Iran really considers to be as essential to its own deterrence, its own defense. And what it has seen over the last year is a very significant downgrading of two of its three pillars of deterrence, its missile program and its militias. Now with the fall of Assad, it basically doesn't have much less other than, and this is where the real point of, the real question mark and the real danger lies, other than its nuclear program. So I think, there is a very significant risk of an uptick of and an acceleration of Iran moving forward on its nuclear program precisely because of its weakening in its other pillars of what it considers to be its deterrence.
All right, so Iran refocusing on its nuclear deterrent. With Trump coming to power, funding from the US is likely to dry up, isn't it? Will that affect Iran's progress on nuclear production?
Well, so, I mean, in the case of the United States, so whereas in the first Trump administration, and we know that, of course, Trump has no sympathies for Iran, and, the hawkishness on Iran really played out in terms of withdrawing and eventually destroying the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Now there isn't really much to destroy. So the real question is, does that hawkishness play out in terms of doubling down on escalation, essentially giving Israel green light to go after Iran's nuclear capacity, which would probably see the United States itself being drawn into a war? But then again, Trump is the no forever wars guy, right? And so this could really go in two very different directions. And there could perhaps, rather unexpectedly, be an interest on the side of the Trump administration to explore avenues for a negotiation with Iran, especially now that, as we were saying, Iran has been weakened quite significantly. Right.
So America's role is perhaps one of negotiations with Iran while supporting Israel at the same time. An interesting dynamic there. I'd like to go back now to Antony Blinken's visit to Ankara and his meeting with Erdogan. What do you think was on the agenda?
Well, I think most certainly the question of, the Kurdish question that we were discussing earlier. On the one hand, we could imagine that Turkey will now want to use this opportunity to squeeze the Kurds. However, what is also, I think, interesting is that about 6 months ago, there was a new Turkish opening internally in Turkey as far as the Kurdish question is concerned, the so-called Kurdish opening that Erdogan sort of put out. And so I think Blinken will try and see how Turkey can essentially be influenced not to double down too strongly against the Kurds. So I think that will be a very specific point of discussion. But then more broadly, try and understand how via Turkey's political capital in Damascus and through perhaps, Western support in terms of reconstruction for Syria now and the eventual lifting of Western sanctions on Syria, essentially the political process in Syria can be influenced so as to ensure an inclusive country.
An inclusive country, well, we look forward to that. But Israel, of course, is not terribly convinced. They've gone into action to destroy weaponry in Syria, lest it be used against them. Are they overreacting, in your opinion?
Well, they tend to these days, don't they? Yes, I think they are. The way in which Israel has moved in to destroy Syria's military capacities to an extent can be understood because, of course, you don't quite know the direction that Syria will move into. And so, of course, there is a risk that these capacities eventually will be used against Israel itself. In the sense, under Bashar al-Assad, it was an enemy that Israel knew well, right? Whereas now you don't quite know how things are going to play out. I think what's quite different is the, in a sense, sort of growing occupation of Syrian territory, the way in which Israel has actually moved in the demilitarized zone of the Golan Heights. And normally, when you move in, it's very difficult to eventually move out. That is the aspect that I find more problematic, paradoxically more than the hitting of the military capacities, which, as I said, could actually have a far more compelling security rationale.
OK. Now, Viktor Orban of Hungary has been trying to insinuate himself into all sorts of negotiations, not least between Ukraine and Russia. He's going down rather well with the Kremlin, but not so much with Zelensky. Do you think Russia's increase in resources on the front lines with Ukraine is going to make any difference to Orban's influence?
Well, it's very clear, and perhaps let's make the connection to the Middle East. There are some people that say, well, a weakened Russia in the Middle East may actually make Russia more inclined to negotiate in Ukraine. I'm not sure I really buy this, to be honest, in the sense that it seems fairly clear to me that this belongs to a very different sphere, so almost mental sphere in the mind of Vladimir Putin. The Middle East is a geopolitical game. Ukraine is an imperial one, and the weakening on one front does not necessarily mean greater willingness to compromise on the other, especially, and this connects to your question, especially given that probably Russia thinks at this point in time that it's winning. So I'm not entirely clear that despite what Orban may be saying and despite what President Trump may want, we are actually going to see a ceasefire in Ukraine anytime soon.
Right, so weakening of Russia in the Middle East, but not so much in Europe. Nathalie Tocci, thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience.
Thank
you. Have a lovely day.
And you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
And that's all from us here on World Talks. Goodbye.